Um, we've been real impacted by the world of what's called transformational education, where adults learn differently than children learn, and we use a circle that's simply called information, practice, reflection. And so you get some information about discipling, about some portion of your discipleship work, and then you go practice that. And then you come back and reflect on what your experience was like. Dallas Willard, when he was writing his book, The Divine Conspiracy, he talked about he made the distinction between church members and disciples. And he said, when is the last time in your church that they taught you a class on how to love your enemies? Or when is the last time that they taught a class on if your brother or sister offends you, go to them and work it out with them? Well, in fact, the way you learn to go to somebody who's offended you is that you hear that teaching and then you go practice obeying. And generally that doesn't go well the first time, and so then you need a coach or a discipler or a mentor, whatever you want to call them, who will help you think through what happened, help you look at all of that, and then will send you back to practice some more. And a lot of the coaching that we do is Grant comes and he says, I'm going to go to this brother who offended me, and then he has that conversation and it doesn't go well. And then in the coaching, what we do is we review with him what happened, and then we'd say, okay, now you need to go back to that brother. And the conversation will go something like this. So you remember the conversation we had yesterday? I didn't do so well in that conversation. I want to try again. And in that information, practice, reflection cycle, you actually learn to master, rather than just have information, you actually learn to master the relationship behaviors that Jesus teaches us about and calls us to. And so the distinction between information and practice is one of the big distinctions that we felt like we had to make. The second big distinction that we had to felt like we had to, or the second big obstacle that we had to confront, is how compartmentalized our discipleship is. And so people have a job, and that's secular, and they spend 40 or 50 or 60 hours a week there. And then there's this sacred stuff that they do that's ministry, that's mission, that's quiet time, that's worship, that's service. And so mission becomes a compartment of their life. And what we began to say is, we'll never transform the cities as long as mission is a compartment of your life. What we've got to do is we've got to find a way to equip people to live missionally where they spend most of their day. And so we began to explore that, and that was so. And I mean, we didn't come up with the idea of missional communities, but what we began to say was, not only do we have to confront the compartmentalization, but we have to confront the individualization. I don't think anywhere in the Bible is there ever an individual mission. There's individual gifting, there's individual calling, but we're always on mission together. And so maybe the first missional community that we formed was the missional community at Kirby Corporation. Kirby is a publicly traded maritime transportation corporation. They're the largest in the world. They're on the New York Stock Exchange. They have a board of directors. They have a non-believing CEO, and they have about 1,000 employees, and there are about 80 or 85 believers there who go to churches all over the city. It's located in downtown Houston. They go to churches all over the city, and the missional community, I call it the Church at Kirby Corporation. They started out just doing small group prayer times and study groups before work or on the noon hour. Over time, when Ivan hit the west coast of Florida, they went to the CEO and said, we'd like to gather people together and take a trip down there, and get trucks and GPS tracking systems and chainsaws and all of that stuff, and find every Kirby Corporation employee and get them up and running. And they did. They took a trip down there, and within about 10 days, everybody in the everybody who was employed by Kirby, whether they were believers or not, the Church at Kirby Corporation had come and served them and gotten them all tarps on their roofs and limbs out on the road, and windows boarded up so that they could begin to function again. Internally, they began to ask the question, what is God's redemptive purpose for Kirby Corporation? Now, that is a really radical way of thinking. We don't think of secular corporations having a purpose in God's design, but actually we believe that when God created everything, including business, that there was a design to that. And so they just began to volunteer for task forces and committees and strategic planning groups, and tried to use their influence to shape the development of Kirby Corporation. When they went to Florida, when they came back, the impact of that was so great. When Jerry Gallion, who's one of the leaders there, writes the story. He says, little did we know that Hurricane Ivan was just a dress rehearsal for what was going to happen with Rita and Ike. And they talk about 10 mission trips that took place. The way he writes it is, while thousands were fleeing the Gulf Coast, the Church at Kirby Corporation was moving toward the Gulf Coast. And so, I mean, that's just one illustration. I could talk to you about missional communities in impoverished neighborhoods. I could talk to you about missional communities in public schools. I want to be real careful to say we're still learning how to do this. Kirby Corporation is a great story. We've got several stories, great stories in schools. One of our missional communities at Hargrove Elementary was just recognized statewide as one of the like service project kind of things where they recognize service leaders. So those are the big components that we attempted to address. We came to, over time, recognize that what we were working on was the ancient work of spiritual formation. I think I've come to believe that one of the unintended consequences of the church growth movement that got adopted as a mental model by churches in the late 60s and early 70s was that we grew churches so rapidly that we lost the capacity to really disciple people. And our discipling moved away from from spiritual formation, and it moved to programmatic kinds of information-based things. And so here's what we do in FaithWalking. We have a website. You sign up on the website. We have a weekend retreat. It's a Friday night, late Friday afternoon, till Friday night at about 8 o'clock. All day Saturday from about 8:30 in the morning till 8:30 at night, and then about a half a day on Sunday. And what we do in that weekend retreat is we hold the life of Jesus up as the fully human life. We talk about Orthodox theology and talk about how Jesus is both fully human and fully God. But in my own journey as a Southern Baptist who grew up in the Deep South, we emphasized the divinity of Christ and never talked about his humanity. And one of the byproducts of that in my own childish thinking was that I thought of Jesus as this 2-year-old who was in the crib thinking, only 31 more years and I can get out of here, go back to where I came from. There was never any sense that Jesus was fully human. I can't do the paradox. I just can't do that. So I can talk about the divinity and I can talk about the humanity. And we didn't talk about the humanity any when I was growing up. And so what we do is we hold Jesus' life up. Jesus had a mission. He heard from God and he lived that mission out, and that's what it means to be fully human. And so we don't follow Jesus to try to become Jesus. We begin to ask the question, how would Jesus live my life if Jesus was a pastor in the Montrose community in Houston? Or how would Jesus live his life if he was worked for the city government? Or how would Jesus live his life if he was a mobilizer of millennials in Dallas? How would Jesus live the life that I have been given to live? And then what we say, and we say this fairly early on, is that the primary thing that stands in the way of our being able to live the life that Jesus lived is that in Western culture, mostly we all have some habitual disobedience in our lives. And that habitual disobedience, we've just incorporated that in. We're not going to do this, but we can start here with Catherine. We can go around the room, and we can end with me, and everybody in the room has some things that we know Jesus says, we know that he teaches, and we just habitually disobey those teachings. What we say in the retreat is that that until we address that habitual disobedience from a shame-free perspective, and begin to then take on learning obedience over time. By the time the weekend is over, we get about 99% success rate in having people talk about their habitual disobedience and then make a commitment to learning obedience in that area. Then we provide a 24-week small group process where you get encouragement and instruction, and every week you get homework where you go practice obedience in your relationships. And so it's not get more information, it's actually go be different in your relationships.